Welcome to the Actionable Futurist podcast, a show all about the near-term future with practical and actionable advice from a range of global experts to help you stay ahead of the curve. Every episode answers the question, what's the future of? With voices and opinions that need to be heard. Your host is international keynote speaker and actionable futurist Andrew Grill.
Today's guest is Shahid Ahmed, Group EVP of New Ventures and Innovation at NTT. He's responsible for driving new digital experiences, offerings and technologies that create growth and transform people's lives and companies. Shahid brings over 25 years of experience leading large services businesses with a focus on business transformation. Most recently, he was a managing partner at Imagine Wireless, a privately held consulting firm driving digital transformation. He was also a co-founder and COO of Equity, a blockchain-based foundation that enables enterprise businesses to securely exchange and share data. Prior to Imagine Wireless, Shahid was a partner at PwC, responsible for several digital businesses, including IoT, emerging technologies, and data and analytics. And he spent 20 years at Accenture as a managing director for Accenture's North America Telecom's $1 billion plus business. Shahid is also a visiting professor teaching Industrial Internet of Things course at McCormick School of Engineering at Northwestern University and is an appointee to the FCC Technology Advisory Council. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Andrew. Very nice to be here.
Off air, we had a bit of a conversation about our respective telecoms careers. I've spent a long time at IBM. You've been at Accenture. I was at Telstra and Optus. I think we've probably both got the scars from Mobile World Congress. We'll talk about that maybe a bit later on. Today, we're going to focus on 5G and specifically private 5G and some of the opportunities for this technology. We covered 5G in Series 2, Episode 4, when I spoke with the CTO of Huawei's Carrier Business Group, Paul Scanlon, a fellow Australian. For those not familiar with NTT, where do you play in 5G and the mobile space?
NTT, as you know, has a very strong brand in Japan because of the Docomo business that we operate and run. Of course, that's very consumer-based, and we have 5G for all of our consumers across all of Japan and its territories. The business side of 5G is operated by a company called NTT Limited. So they're more B2B enterprise focused. And so the way we view private 5G is through the lenses of enterprises, in particular CIOs. And so what we've done is architected a solution very much catered and custom built for an enterprise for their specific requirements. So we view that as an extension of their LAN and IT environment.
So in late 2021, NTT launched the first globally available private 5G offering. So can you explain how a private 5G network differs from a public 5G network that many of our listeners might be using today?
In fact, we were just talking about this yesterday to a customer who were initially looking into a public 5G network to support their use cases. There's some major structural differences. Number one, a private 5G network has dedicated licensed spectrum appropriated by the regulator directly to the enterprise. So in the US, you can go to the FCC after 10 clicks. You can actually get yourself a piece of license and spectrum dedicated to your use case for your IT environment. That spectrum is in the 3.5 gigahertz range. They call it CBRS here. And in many other Western European countries, the regulators also followed the same suit. So they've appropriated spectrum directly to the enterprise. Germany is one of them. UK is another. France and Netherlands and Belgium are also countries that are very quickly looking into that option. So that's the one major structural difference between a private and a public 5G network, that you have your own license. The second one is that you're building a network behind your firewall, and that it is essentially an extension of your LAN. It's an extension of your Wi-Fi infrastructure, perhaps, but it is purposely built for your environment. And so that's the second big difference. And it's a big one because you can now provision that SIM, that device at your leisure. And I really mean that, if you go to a carrier, it may take hours, maybe even days to provision devices. Whereas if you have something that's part of your network, you can do that immediately within a couple of seconds. So you have control and security built into that architecture. The third big structural difference is that you can design and architect that network based on your coverage requirements, as opposed to a public network where you're really constrained with where the nearest cell site might be or where the carrier might opt to build that cell site based on not only the customer requirements, but the public requirements that they have.
Private 5G is fairly new to me in terms of my understanding, so I'm going to learn a lot on the podcast today. Does it allow you to use off-the-shelf 5G consumer devices, but with the SIM card in there, it would then work on there? So the use case might be, I want my employees to have fast internet around the campus. So the off-the-shelf 5G device will do voice and data, and maybe there's no 5G coverage because the carrier hasn't rolled it out, but all of a sudden on my warehouse estate, I've got high-speed, secure voice and data.
Absolutely. I think, Andrew, a couple of things we're observing in the marketplace, and we've been involved with a number of different pilots and now some production implementations. The first thing is that a number of these installations are data only. So they're connecting OT devices and specifically devices that are inside the factory floor or mining operation or a industrial complex. And so they're mainly data-only devices as opposed to voice. Now, there are some instances where the customer has these handsets, for example, at airports where the security personnel or the operational personnel have a phone that's locked onto the private network. And you can use push-to-talk and leverage the voice part of the private 5G network, including the data. So, yes, the actual Apple 13 phones support today CBRS frequencies, 3.5 gigahertz. In fact, France is going to adopt the same band as well. And so right off the bat, if you actually come to one of our campuses here in Silicon Valley, you can bring your iPhone and lock in right into our NTT private 5G network immediately and start making phone calls.
So when I spoke with Paul at Huawei and we talked about the broader uses of 5G, everyone thinks that 5G is just about speed. I know we're going to talk about IoT, and as everything becomes IoT enabled and you've got literally billions of devices needing to connect wirelessly, talk to me a bit of a refresher course for those who didn't listen to the last podcast episode, but the whole nature of 5G, it's not just speed, it's capacity and coverage, isn't it?
Actually, we did a survey of 200 CIOs within the industrial, manufacturing, automotive sector, the three big segments that are we think are the largest, will be the largest consumers and are the largest consumers of private 5G private networks. And almost unanimously, all of them came back and said, we are deploying private networks not because of latency, speeds, and feeds, but because of security and control. If they want to connect their conveyor belts, their machine vision cameras, and forklifts, and what have you, they want to make sure that it is completely secure, airtight network that cannot be subjected to risks associated with hacks, ransomware, and other things. These are mission critical applications. And believe me, I went to one of our customers, Schneider Electric. We made a public announcement about them, and Wall Street Journal ran a big article. And we went to their factory, and it's forget about just trying to put equipment in the factory floor, but trying to enter the factory itself is a monumental Herculean effort just to try to get in. And so I think there is going to be a lot of opportunities around security, managing security because of private 5G network.
So really interesting use case around security. So my question then is, for those who haven't deployed a 5G private network, they're just using Wi-Fi at the moment. Is that a fair assumption?
Look, everybody uses Wi-Fi. It's it's so ubiquitous, whether it's a factory floor or a enterprise campus or a mall. Wi-Fi is always going to be there. I think this notion of private networks or private 5G will replace Wi-Fi. I think that's a wrong way to look at it. And in fact, when we deploy private networks for our customers, they keep the Wi-Fi network there. I mean, people still have iPads and ruggedized laptops. They're always going to be connecting to the Wi-Fi network. That's never going to change. I don't think it will. Now, if the customer wanted to provide coverage in a parking lot where they've got thousands of cars ready to be shipped out inside a cargo train, and they're all waiting in a parking lot, and you're trying to flash them with the latest release of software, and you need pretty darn good coverage, Wi-Fi may not be the right answer because you'll need thousands of access points all over the parking lot covering tens of thousands of cars. And so private 5G might be a better solution. But if you're looking to connect your IT infrastructure, your laptops, your iPads, I think Wi-Fi will always be around.
So is it fair to say that the standards, the 5G standards, the evolution of mobile networks, I've not seen private 4G unless I've missed the memo, but is it because there's something about 5G that allows this coexisting of private spectrum and public spectrum?
Well, there is definitely private LTE. So, and in fact, many of the customers are starting with private LTE and then migrating to private 5G. Now, I wish we would all start with private 5G, but unfortunately, the devices aren't there. And so if any of your listeners are from the device ecosystem, please build some 5G devices because it's really holding up the adoption of 5G. 5G is here. The infrastructure is here. The network is here. But you need the devices ultimately, right, to make that application pop and that use case really become very useful, productive for the end users. To answer your question, LTE first and then private 5G.
According to IDC, the private 5G market is forecast to grow to 5.7 billion in 2024. You just mentioned one of the things holding back adoption is terminals and devices. What are the other key drivers for private 5G adoption?
I think it's spectrum. And the regulators really also have to get on with this new movement where, the carriers are not the only ones that can have the spectrum. It should be allocated to anybody who wants to build a private cellular network. And so, my appeal to all the regulators, and I also wear an FCC hat in the U.S., is that regulators should try to look at what's happening in Germany, UK, US, France, and other places, much like Wi-Fi, when the governments opened up the spectrum 2.4 gigahertz and other ISM spectrum. It really proliferated, not only from a device perspective, but economically. I mean, a number of companies that started to play in the Wi-Fi connectivity space became almost a household consumer device. So I think we'll see the same trajectory here should the governments make that leap. But I think it will happen. It's just a matter of time.
Just an aside, Wi-Fi, some people may not know that it was the CSIRO back in Australia that helped bring that to market. I actually remember back with my friends at Ericsson at Telstra, they gave me a prototype 802.11a device. It was a chunky base station and a PCMCI card. And I remember walking around the offices in Sydney at Telstra with my laptop with these two little rabbit antennas out sticking out, and everyone going, "How come you're not connected via Ethernet? How are you doing this? This is." I said, "This is the future. I'm a futurist." So I've been involved with that sort of space for a while. And yeah, you're right. The Wi-Fi, everything has Wi-Fi these days. We couldn't imagine that. The whole notion of spectrum and regulators allowing that, is there enough spectrum to go around, or will we see other frequencies in the 5G, different bands, be available for public use? And what about if every factory in a row all wants a 5G network? How do we control that?
Well, first of all, I think there is a lot of spectrum to go around. I do believe that. The technology, the radio technology, the software has improved so much to chipsets that it can leverage and optimize for little spectrum, right? So you don't need a lot of spectrum like the old days. You remember 2G and 3G, right? So I think there is spectrum available, and I think in the U.S. The government and FCC is looking into even broadening the spectrum allocated to the enterprise. So I think if the regulators start to dig deep into this, and there is a definite business case, there is an economic GDP dimension to this. And I think, with the technologies that we have at the moment, spectrum sharing is a reality. And it can be shared, and it can coexist with public infrastructure.
I know regulators listen to this podcast around the world, so there's the plea. If you're hearing this, there is a real opportunity. So you spend a lot of time at IoT, and I'm sure you've spent a lot of time thinking and working with digital twins. And they're often mentioned when we talk about Industry 4.0. So talk to me about how private 5G can transform cities with digital twins.
I've been talking about digital twin for a while, but to be frank with you, I think just last few months is when we really started to see digital twin applications pop up in the industrial space. And I think a lot of that has to do with COVID, where, a lot of folks couldn't come into the factory or to the office, and they had to improvise and do things differently. And I think, private networks, particular 5G networks, are going to be very important for that type of use case, including AR, VR, and training. As you're at the job looking at a piece of equipment, put on the AR module, and you can now see not only when that equipment was last serviced right in front of you, but how to turn the screw in a certain way, and the torque force you need, and so on. And by the way, I've seen those in my own experience, and it's amazing that some of the equipment you can't just yank it out. You have to be extremely careful how you manage that, and each bolt and nut is different than the other. So it makes it real when you actually put on an AR VR set. But you can also now imagine creating a digital twin in advance and being able to turn that same very simple piece of equipment. It's a nut, but you can do that in your office space and practice so that you don't mess it up at the site itself. And you can mimic how quickly you turn it, and you can break it too, right? And that's okay. You can break it in a software environment, but you obviously don't want to do that. And so there's a bunch of use cases like that out there. At NTT, we actually built a digital twin for Tour de France cyclists. That's one of the main pain points is that you don't want to mess with the bike itself as well, right? Because they're, just like Formula One cars, they're very expensive machines. And tweaking just even a little part, whether it's the handle position or the where the brake pads lie. All of that can be done on a computer in front of your MacBook and tweaked, and it will tell you what your drag is, what your incline speeds are, all those sophisticated things that cyclists look at. So I think there's going to be a lot of use cases. 5G will play a big part because of latency and how that data is carried across the network itself. And so you have to be very secure and controlled environment.
So if we're talking on this podcast in, let's say, 5 years' time, the licensing challenges have been overcome, the technology and the terminal have been overcome, what use cases would you like to see that maybe aren't possible now that you think will really sing when you've got private 5G involved?
I'm really hoping in 5 years that there are use cases that you and I don't even know about, right? I think that is where I want to see the market go, where, folks like myself, you, who are not at least I'm not the most creative person, but there's got to be somebody out there that could say, okay, I want to create the next Uber app or Instagram app or what have you, not only just for the business side, but also the consumer side. I'd like to see that happen too. But I think most of the innovation on 5G will happen in the enterprise, in the B2B first, and then we will see it transcend to the consumer side. In 3G and 4G, we saw consumer drive those applications, and then they made their way to the enterprise. I think this time around, 5 years from now, we will see enterprises drive that innovation, and we'll see consumers adopt it afterwards. So looking forward to that.
It reminds me of back in the late 90s, playing with WAP, Wireless Application Protocol. I found a video the other day. I was actually standing on the street in Sydney with my Nokia 8110, the banana phone, scrolling through the different menus. And I'm thinking now, why did we put up with that? Consumers, I think, are somewhat resilient in just wanting access to information. We wouldn't have put up with that now. But one of the things that I'm really excited about 5G generally, and I want to get your perspective on private 5G, is edge computing. I've seen a number of pilots, some commercial launches where companies like AWS are actually putting servers in the base station. So when you talk about latency, if you can remove the latency between the base station and the HLR and those sort of things, you're actually putting the computing power at the site of the antenna. Talk to me about, first of all, how that works, because you're probably a little bit more versed in that than I am, and then where private 5G really sings when you've got edge computing working in 5G.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think there will be a number of edge applications. We're already seeing them. And to be honest with you, we view edge applications very simplistically. And I think the industry in general has kind of overcomplicated the problem set. All it is a compute storage device sitting next to your conveyor belt. Not to oversimplify, but that's kind of how factory operations managers are looking at it. So let's say you have a machine vision camera, highly industrialized optical lenses. Essentially, it's a 4K camera with AI in the back end. Now, it can capture tons of events. We know one camera that can do almost 10,000 events per second. Everything from it can look at as people are walking in to jitter inside a conveyor belt, all simultaneously processed. Now, it needs to take action, right? It's great that you can process this stuff, but what if you wanted to take action based on that event? Either to stop the conveyor belt or to tell a worker as they're walking in to put on your helmet, or there is a poisonous gas inside the mining operation or the factory. You need to alert everybody. You need that edge compute capability inside the factory floor to be able to process that very quickly. Can't wait for the cloud. And come back, right? It's just going to turnaround time, latency is going to take too long. So for all of those mission critical applications inside the factory that require ultra low latency, you need that storage compute device sitting there. One of which is we know we work with Schneider Electric, and they've got these pods. They literally look like your refrigerator inside your hotel room. It has a really sophisticated cooling system inside, right? As you can imagine, you need to cool your servers inside. But it looks exactly like that. You put your rack in there. You've got storage, and it's got HVAC, and it's got all the bells and whistles of a typical data center, except it's this small. It's tiny. It's and you can put in the EPC, all the eNode beads if you wanted to, and run it, including the application server itself. So I think that's the future, and you really need that kind of edge, if you want to call it edge, capability at the factory floor, closest to the application as possible.
I've always tried to get my head around 5G and edge because I can't see the Vodafone's EEs here in the UK or the Verizons in the US or NTT putting a minibar-sized server at every single one of hundreds of thousands of base stations in a network. But I think you're right, where you have a controlled, tightly formed network that might only have 3 or 4 serving cells because it's a fairly small area, you can actually afford physically and financially to have those at the source. Where do you see the broader, wider campus opportunity for this type of edge computing in commercial networks?
It's a difficult sell there, to be frank with you. It's, I wouldn't say an easy sell because even carriers are going to have a hard time putting that mini refrigerator inside the factory floor. And you really need a system integration capability to make that really happen. In other contexts, in other places, I just don't see a real application behind that. And again, I feel like the industry in general has really needs to ratchet down the capabilities that a MEC or an edge compute device offers, and we need to really simplify what it all means. So the factory manager, the IT manager, is able to consume it properly and architect it as part of their infrastructure.
So your title is Group EVP of New Ventures and Innovation. So how do you drive innovation at NTT?
We're constantly looking at bringing innovative ideas to our customers. So that's first and foremost. And if that allows us to make it more repeatable, great. But we want to make sure that the innovation, the creative parts are being applied to that customer for that customer. And then on the new venture side, I'm constantly looking for new opportunities to build businesses for NTT. That's that's a function that is most companies have that, so it's nothing new, but it is something I'm always keeping an eye on and seeing if there's something we can bring to the market industry in general.
And where do you get your best ideas from?
Folks like you, Andrew, we've been there. We've seen it. And if there is, there's always a lesson out there, right? Whether it was WAP and the customer experience behind that. And look, I used to use WAP all the time. And I remember and 9/11 here in the US, I was sitting on a plane and going through my phone through the WAP browser and was able to figure out what was happening, right? Otherwise, nobody kind of knew. But it was the best thing that was there at the time. And yeah, we all learn from it many different ways, and we see the cycle happen throughout. And being able to anticipate what's going to happen next, I think that has some, having the knowledge of 2020 hindsight, I think it's important. And being able to understand when those cycles happen, at what point, I think it is critical, and it will be critical in the future too, because I personally can't keep up with everything that's happening around us.
So you mentioned the pandemic. We've got a lot of learnings over the last couple of years. What's been your experience over the last couple of years as we move towards a more distributed workforce?
Well, I fully expect people to come into the office. I think we all got tired of sitting in our, basements. And I think there will be, um, but at the same time, there will be structural changes how we work, period. Um, there will be a lot of nomadic employees um, who would want to work from anywhere in the world. Forget about home. They want to work from Cartagena, Colombia, because it's the same time zone, but it is beautiful there and it's always 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if a company doesn't adapt to those kinds of structural differences coming out of the pandemic, I think we'll still continue to face challenges in terms of labor shortages, talent, and being able to keep good employees within the company. So we'll have to adapt. I think there's that chapter is still unfinished in terms of how we work after the pandemic and the future of work itself. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how companies deal with that. I think there will be a lot of companies and employees wanting to come back, but there's going to be a lot of companies wanting to stay and be nomadic and work from anywhere.
So part of the nomadic thing is for existing employees who want to work somewhere different. But have you seen that a distributed workforce allows you to source talent anywhere in the world that you didn't think you'd have access to? I mean, you're on the West Coast. You have a whole access to talent anywhere in the world that maybe you hadn't even thought about because they can't come into the office, but they can actually work in a distributed way.
I think so. Look, we work with a developer at the moment. They're out of Colombia, actually, just speaking of Colombia. And, we don't, I don't feel any different than if they were in the Valley or Chicago, anywhere else. So, yeah, I think, Colombia is one of the countries in South America, I want to get this right, that have the highest per capita computer scientists in the world. Some don't quote me on this, but I think it's somewhere. It's one of the largest or one of the highest GDP per capita computer science. And so why not leverage that workforce? And they're fully capable and they're fantastic to work with. And so I think I think that is the future. You could be anywhere.
We've learned a lot about private 5G. We've learned a lot about digital twins. But before we let you go, I want to run you through a quick fire round where we ask you some quick questions. So a quick answer is a good answer. iPhone or Android?
iPhone.
Window or aisle?
Window.
Online or in the room?
In the room.
What's the app you use most on your phone?
United Airlines, unfortunately.
What's the one thing you won't be doing again post-pandemic?
I would like to burn all of my sweatpants and sweatshirts.
Who should be my next guest on the podcast?
I would invite the FCC current Chairman Rosendahl. She's incredible, lots of energy, and I think the other regulators can really learn from her and the policies she's implementing here in the U.S.
Well, I like to dream big on this podcast, so I'll reach out to her and see what it says. I'll mention that you recommended her. That might help seal the deal. So as this is the Actionable Futurist podcast, what 3 actionable things should our audience do today when it comes to better understanding the power of private 5G?
Great question. I think number 1 is look at the spectrum policy and in your individual jurisdictions, countries, regions, and learn a little bit about spectrum. Everything wireless starts with spectrum, as you know, Andrew, right? And I think, in fact, I would even ping your regulator if there is a way to connect with them and communicate with them, do that and ask them why spectrum has not been appropriated to the enterprise directly if your region doesn't have that already.
So how can people find out more about you and your work?
Go to the global.ntt. You'll find us, and we have a little blog. I keep up with LinkedIn quite a bit, and you should be able to get a hold of me anytime. And feel free to reach out to me.
A great discussion today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Very nice discussion, great questions, and look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you for listening to the Actionable Futurist podcast. You can find all of our previous shows at actionablefuturist.com. And if you like what you've heard on the show, please consider subscribing via your favourite podcast app so you never miss an episode. You can find out more about Andrew and how he helps corporates navigate a disruptive digital world with keynote speeches and C-suite workshops delivered in person or virtually at actionablefuturist.com. Until next time, this has been the Actionable Futurist Podcast.